correct you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, we're about at the 1 o'clock mark. So I think that we should be good to get started as folks join in. I'm going to share just quickly in the chat a few helpful links for today's webinar, just so folks have it ahead of time and can open those up. I will also circulate the links by email later on, so not to worry, but just so you have those for today. And so, yeah, let's just to get started and dive right in. My name is Hannah Holmes, pronounced she and her. I am the program director at PLEAC, the Public Legal Education Association of Canada. I see some familiar names in the chat. And for those of you who are returning, nice to see you. For some new faces, thanks so much for joining today. It's nice to have you. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge that I am located here in Toronto, Ontario, on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So for today's Share and Learn webinar, we are joined by Malika Roy from the National Right to Housing Network, or NRHN. Today's webinar, we will provide an overview of Canada's evolving legal framework on human right to housing, including the National Housing Strategy Act, key decisions on economic and social rights, and Canada's international commitments. This session will focus on practical considerations for PLEI organizations, including how to communicate housing rights accurately in plain language and address common public questions and misconceptions. We have a lot to get to, and really excited to have you joining us today. Just a quick reminder before I pass it over, the webinar is being recorded. It'll be available on our website afterwards, after the session's done today. I appreciate if everyone as well, there's gonna be a little survey pop up at the end. Feel free to complete that. It'll take just a minute. And also feel free to ask questions and share your comments anytime during the webinar today. You can use the chat. There's a Q&A function as well. And we will have time at the end to answer those. Yeah, and I think that's about it on my end. I think, wow, 2 minutes, that's great. Usually I talk faster to get through that. But that's so great to have you again. I will pass it over to you and let you start us off.
Thanks, Hannah. That was great and that was really quick. Thanks so much for having me. We are really grateful to PLEAC for this opportunity for this collaboration, and I really look forward to the session. So I'll just, as introduced, my name is Ambalika Roy. I work as a legal education coordinator at the National Right to Housing Network, and I do have a slide on what we do at the National Right to Housing Network, or NRHN for short. So I'll just, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is what we are. So the National Right to Housing Network brings together over 2,000 advocates, partner organizations, rights claimants to advance the human right to housing in Canada. Our organization and colleagues have been integral to securing the legal commitment we have currently in Canada to right to housing. And we act as a connective tissue for the housing justice movement. So that's what we do. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I would like to begin with this beautiful quote. We always do. We love this quote. I hope you like it too. So the right to housing is not just a rallying cry. It, like human rights, more generally offer concrete standards that can be implemented and measured for progress. It's a beautiful quote and also summarizes right to housing very well. And we always think that this is something, it's a foundational to begin the concept of right to housing through this. We can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so before I begin, even to the what the Canada's commitment are, let us just go with this basic question. Where does right to housing comes from? And I know many of you are well aware of the history of right to housing, so I'll be super quick here. So the UN Declarations of the Human Rights of 1948, which is the key source of all where human rights are documented, and they were written and countries have signed onto all the rights that we agreed to, and including Canada. And that means that we have all agreed to these rights. So it is a common standard for fundamental and international human rights and freedoms to be protected. And it's for all people, irrespective of who we are, where we come from, our religion, our sex, ethnicity, anything, any parameters. And this declaration introduces the right to adequate housing as one of the component for adequate standard of living. But then rights were divided into two sets: civil and political rights, like the right to life, equality before law, freedom of expression. And then we have another bucket of rights. It's called the economic, social, and cultural rights, like the right to education, right to adequate housing, and right to work, and many others. So obviously, since there were two sets of rights, two different covenants were drafted. And right to adequate housing was elaborated in the International Convention on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, which came into existence in 1966, and Canada ratified, that means agreed to it and signed on to it in 1976. It's been 50 years. Um, so there where we get our right to housing from. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And I have a question there. What do we mean by adequate housing? What does comes to your mind when you hear the word adequate housing? And I can stop here for a minute for your kind of responses. Please feel free to write in one word or two word in the chat. Any responses? I have not seen anything so far. Whatever comes to your mind when you hear safe and healthy space, safety, clean water, sufficient space, safe and affordable, accessible, security of tenure. Oh, the chat is moving so fast. The comfortable and safe. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Most of you have nailed it down very well, which we will just see in the next slide. What it actually means. Enough space for all occupants. Yes, absolutely. So what do we mean by it in the legal standards or in the international law? So you can see the 7 standards in this slide. So we have the legal security of tenure, we have availability of services and materials, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. So if we have to summarize all of this together in short, it means that you have a right to stay in your home unless you break the terms of the rental agreement, which means the security of tenure. It means you have the basic right to safe, accessible, and affordable home, which many of you have already noted in the chat, where you don't have to sacrifice other basic needs like food or healthcare just to pay your rent. Your home should meet your accessibility needs, should be close to your schools, work, and essential services, and be properly maintained. Another important thing is also to note, as you can see in this slide, that since right to housing comes as the economic, social, and cultural rights, these are meant to be progressively realized, another legal term, meaning that the government must use their maximum available resources to fulfill these rights within specified timeline and possibly the shortest timeline. So that is something very integral to the economic, social, and cultural rights, and ensure that it meets the needs of the people who are most impacted. So a wealthy nation such as Canada is expected to achieve way more than a country with fewer resources. Also, there is more to right to housing than just these components of adequacy that I just mentioned. They are equally relevant. There are obligations of the government to ensure sound access to justice mechanisms, tax measures, participatory policies, and planning processes, and regulating investors so that we don't treat home as just an asset. It's meant to be a home. So that's what, in a nutshell, right to housing, where it comes from. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so despite that we saw that Canada ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1976, 50 years ago, the right to adequate housing was not really a legislated human right until we have the Canadian law in 2019 called the National Housing Strategy Act. So here is a reminder what advocacy can bring forward and also to celebrate the wins of the right to housing movement. So there's a story here. So we'll talk about a landmark case, which many of you might already know. It was the first constitutional challenge before the courts arguing how homelessness is a right to life issue. So in 2012, in the case of Tanujaja, where Jennifer Tanujaja and there were 4 other people who had experienced in different ways significant housing insecurity, along with an organization called SERA, now called CCHR, the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, claimed both government action and inaction were responsible for Canada's inadequate housing and homelessness crisis. It was argued that it violates the Charter especially Section 7 that outlines the right to life and security of the person. They argued that the government failed to fulfill their obligations to address homelessness and violated the right to equality. So there were several pages of evidence which were filed with the court. I think there were over 9,000 pages of evidence, is what I have heard from the people who actually were part of the case. But despite those thousands of pages of evidence filed by an extensive team of grassroots organizations and experts, the case was ultimately dismissed in 2014. Very disappointing. And the evidence was not even reviewed when appealed to the Superior Court. So it was dismissed in a very early stage. So obviously, you can imagine the frustration of the sector, frustration of the advocates, the lived experts who were part of the case. And it was interpreted also in later cases that people living in homelessness almost do not have the charter protections like any other Canadians, which was even furthermore disappointing and a very, very dangerous precedent. So what happened next was a strategic advocacy by several housing advocates, organizations who actively engaged with the UN mechanism to bring forward Canada's not taking action towards right to housing commitments. And finally, in 2015, the new government came to power. They expressed some openness to implement right to housing. And in 2017, Canada got its first national housing strategy, the document that reflects policies, programs on housing in Canada, and how will the government be, working towards that. Then there was an open letter campaign to the then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, which was signed by several people, several organizations, prominent Canadians. And finally, there was a draft legislation which was also provided to the government that we got the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019. And it's the first ever human rights law on right to housing. So which is a big win for the movement, for the sector. Can I go to the next slide, please? Okay, so before we move on to what National Housing Strategy Act says, let's take a look at a few myths around right to housing and what it actually is. So, as you can see, there's a myth that it means government must provide homes to everyone. No, that's not really true. It requires the government to ensure that everyone has an access to adequate housing within available resources. It's a progressive realization, so the maximum available resources have to be used by the government to make these policies or make adequate housing available, and also to prioritize the needs of the people who are most impacted, like people experiencing homelessness. But it doesn't mean that the government has to provide housing to everybody. Let's go to the next myth. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so the next one is a lot of times you will hear that right to housing is merely a goals and aspirations. Again, a myth. It does put a legal standard. It puts a responsibility on the government to take action, to treat homelessness as a human rights violation, and also take urgent action because it is an urgent cause that needs that action. Also, there is this new act, which we will talk about in a moment, the National Housing Strategy Act, which also ensures that we need to meaningfully engage with rights holders, the people whose rights are affected, and the impacted people, identifying the systemic housing issues, which is impacting so many people, and also develop solutions that are practical, that are identifiable, practical, and tangible. So it is not really a goal and aspiration. It is definitely a legal standard. There's a responsibility on the government to act on it. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is another one that you would be hearing, that it's only responsibility of the federal government to implement right to housing. Actually, that's not correct too. Though the federal government are centrally focused, especially for the review panels and the systemic housing issues through the National Housing Strategy Act. But as you saw in the earlier slides, that right to housing came from international law, to which all levels of government have a commitment. So it is not that only feds are to implement the right to housing. It does passes on the responsibility to all levels of government to act on it. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so here is what the National Housing Strategy Act says. So in 2019, we adopted this law, and this law introduces, as you can see this quote, that what it actually means, you can already read it here. And this law introduces a parallel access to justice mechanism, which includes a federal housing advocate, a National Housing Council, and a review panel, which can hear about systemic housing issues from rights holders. And I'm repeating this term about systemic housing issues again and again. We do have a slide to explain what systemic housing issues are, to kind of understand what we mean by that. Uh, so this three mechanisms. There's an provision for making recommendations aligned to the human rights law, which we just saw, and Canada's commitment, and send those recommendations to the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, who also has a responsibility to respond them. So there are four main pillars of the Act: the National Housing Council, the Federal Housing Advocate, and the review panels, and the Minister of Housing, of course. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is a closer look at the entire National Housing Strategy Act and all the mechanisms. So let's take a look at what is the National Housing Council. So it is an advisory body that brings together people from across the country, including those with lived experiences, community advocates, and other housing experts, to check on how the policies are actually working in practice. The council advises the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure to ensure that Canada realizes right to housing progressively. That means use their maximum available resources and response to the need of the people who are most impacted. So that's what National Housing Council does. Then we have the Federal Housing Advocate, who is an independent, non-partisan watchdog who can hold the government accountable for their right to housing commitments. So Mary Jose Hull is the first and the current housing advocate and is a key driver for bringing the systemic change in housing issues. And her responsibilities, as you can see in this slide, so they can conduct research, receive testimony about systemic housing issues. They can actively engage with people, the rights holders, the communities whose rights are violated. They can receive submissions from individuals and groups about housing rights violations and make recommendations to the minister. And in generally speak about human rights violation and, of course, to implement how the law is moving forward. Then we have the review panels. So the review panel is consisted of three members from the National Housing Council, which you just saw. So three people are appointed to convene a human rights-based hearings on a particular systemic housing issue. And we will just see in the next slides the review panels that has already happened. So the panel can hold public hearings, listen to people directly who are impacted on specific issues like from tenants, unhoused people, or advocates, and then issue a formal list of recommendations with solutions that needs to be taken to address those issues to the Minister of Housing. And the Minister of Housing has also got a time-bound response, like they have to respond within 120 days through the Senate or the other house. And this all the recommendations that are being developed by the review panel, they help to identify solutions to which are necessary for reforming laws, policies, programs that affect the housing and homelessness in Canada. So it has got a direct linkage. So there are practical solutions which are provided by the review panels. And the minister plays an important role because they can receive recommendations from the National Housing Council, the advocate, as well as the review panel, and they have to respond through Senate or House of Commons within 120 days, so which is the time-bound thing, and it's a statutory body. So it's very important to note the time here because it is not that the recommendations goes to the minister and the minister can sit with it. So there's an action on the minister's part as well. So in totality, this law is a very significant because it does establishes right to housing beyond a poster writing. The quote that you saw in the beginning about it's just not a rallying cry. It does hold the government accountable to its actions and commitments. So it's a very significant law that was passed in 2019, and this would only work when people are engaging through the law, and that's the reason we are having this conversation today and having this session today, so that more and more people engage through this law. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so since we are talking about systemic issue again and again, so what do we mean by systemic issue? Um, so we know that many people are struggling to find a safe, affordable place to live in. We know that rents are rising everywhere and there aren't enough affordable homes for everyone. Some renters, like newcomers to Canada or people with low incomes, face unfair treatment or are pushed out of housing or communities where they are working or where they study or where their family lives. People with accessibility needs often struggle to find homes that suit their needs. So these are issues that affects not one individual, but communities. And they're also not caused by accidents. but for faulty policies, for lack of stronger protections, rental protections, or treating home as a way to make money. So all this in a nutshell are systemic housing issues, and they affect marginalized communities disproportionately, as we can all understand that. So that's a few examples of systemic housing issues. There could be many, several others that you see in your communities and probably are working with. Can I move to the next slide, please? Okay, so we'll just take a look at the review panels that has already happened. We had three review panels. We had two review panels which are completed, and there's an ongoing review panel. So the first one happened in 2022, and that was on financialization of rental housing. Many of you are well aware of what financialization of housing means. It refers when housing is primarily treated as a financial asset and a tool to help investors make money, or and this contributes exponentially to rent hikes, as we all know. The first review panel heard issues around this issue, particularly from the purpose-built rentals. So there were civil society who spoke about, what's happening on the ground. There were human rights experts. There were tenants organizations. And there were over 190 submissions which were received by the panel. The people spoke about rising rents or aggressive evictions that we see around the country, displacement, growing role of corporate landlords in shaping Canada's housing system. And there were several recommendations which came from the panel. And one of the successful recommendations, which what we would say is which led to the development of the Federal Tenant Protection Fund, which was created to support tenant organizing, legal supports, and community-based efforts aimed at protecting renters who are facing displacement and housing insecurity. It also led to the Renter Bill of Rights, which came in 2024, which was attached to a conditional funding for provinces. So which is also kind of as a result of one of the recommendations which was there in the financialization review panel. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so the next panel was on the housing issues faced by women and gender diverse people in Canada. So it was called the NEHA panel, and it focused on the challenges women and gender diverse folks particularly experience in housing. It started with very two powerful human rights claims made by the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and the National Indigenous Housing and Homelessness Network to the Federal Housing Advocate that highlighted, how women and gender diverse folks are affected through the several lack of faulty policies around the country and called for immediate action. The panel was heard from over 500 people, including lived experts, advocates, organizations, and the final report was released in 2025 November, so it's not long ago, with many recommendations, including urging the government to adopt a rights-based intersectional housing policy, ensuring meaningful participation in different kinds of areas of housing policies program, also removing the discrimination that happens or experienced by women and gender diverse people while accessing housing to make housing more inclusive and accessible for them. So that's the second panel that we heard from. And there was okay, so can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is the third and the ongoing panel that is happening currently. It is looking at the lack of accessible housing and how it's impacting communities. So it looks at the gaps in policies and the housing services that we see, and also is looking for solutions that the government or the communities can lead to basically to address these gaps. So they just completed their written submissions on June 22nd. And right now, their oral hearings, decentralized oral hearings are happening across the country, but there is still opportunity to engage with this panel. And this is a very important issue and a very, again, it is a very diverse issue because a lot of people have taken part. And what we have heard is over 340 submissions have been already received till June by the panel. So that's the third panel which we're talking about. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, let's take a look at what we learned from this, because this is how it's going to inform our future work and also how we can make the systems better and why we should engage with the system. So one of the things that we would always say is this process matters because many rights holders, understandably, who enters this process, they might not even probably expect that their testimonies would lead to something tangible. So this process was not perfect. Again, I am kind of giving that disclaimer. And changes does not happen overnight as well, because you would ask often that what happened to the recommendations? Did anything happen after that? But we have seen examples where lived expertise, organizing, and collective advocacy have helped shift national conversations and influence federal action in real and tangible ways in how they are framing, housing policies in Canada. We also saw that the deeply marginalized people engaged in this meaningful dialogue, and as a result, we have seen the federal housing policy begin to shift towards issues that previously were not really, taken account of, or not being so much into the national conversation. There were also another important lesson that we learned is review panels can help connect experiences happening across the country. A lot of people have similar barriers, have faced similar barriers, but probably didn't know that that was happening in the other part of the country as well. So people across country were describing many of the same barriers, harms, and violations, whether related to displacement, encampment evictions, discrimination, or unsafe housing conditions. So that is something people connected to each other. That was a huge learning. Another thing is that participation can't just mean asking people to show up or share deeply personal experiences without support. So across the earlier review panels, what we saw was that organizations and community groups played a very important role in helping people understand how this process works. It's not an easy process, like coming there, making submissions, or even in the oral submissions, giving your testimony. So there were a lot of support that we saw from the communities and organizations for people who are making those submissions, prepare them, access the interpretations, or even providing accommodations wherever needed, so that the process feels safe and participatory. So that was and that's a key part of this law. So that is what we saw. It is still evolving. Again, as I said, it's a new law. Also, the process highlighted the power of collaboration, which is very, very, very important. Some of the strongest advocacy and submissions that we saw emerged where when lived experts, grassroots organizations, and legal advocates, researchers, service providers, everybody came together collectively and made the submission. So those were the strongest ones. So there was a lot of power in collective advocacy is what we saw. And more importantly, the work does not end with recommendations. Once the recommendations are released, it doesn't mean our work has ended there. Because in many ways, there are another phase of the work that begins with the recommendations, receiving the recommendations. The advocacy, the ongoing advocacy, organizing, the public education around what those recommendations can mean for people, how they can impact people. Those are very important pieces of this entire process. And that's why we say that it does not end with the recommendations. Probably it's another beginning, because where you start to demand the accountability that the government owes towards this recommendation. So that's something is worth mentioning as well. Can we move on to the next slide? Okay, here is what you can do as a PLEI organization. What we find on the ground when we talk about these issues are there's a lot of huge lack of information around what right to housing means and how it impacts communities. Because people understands renters' rights, people do understand that those are very tangible. Like how are you affected? But when you talk about systemic housing issues, it's not super tangible for people to understand how it impacts them. So, including concise content around what right to housing means as an overview in your sessions that you hold with communities, highlighting Canada's commitment or this new access to justice mechanism through the Federal Housing Advocate, the review panels. It's very important to include those in your sessions, like in a very small snippets of it. Supporting communities to engage with the this entire new law, the NHSA, like supporting them in submissions, collecting evidences, voices from the ground. Also sharing the recommendations is another key part. Like once the review panel has happened, we forget that. But ultimately, when you get the recommendations, what those recommendations are, it's important to kind of disseminate that through people. So that's something, it's an important, and I think PLEI organizations can play an excellent role here, supporting community to use it for their own advocacy asks like for example, for the NEHA panel, the organizations working on women's rights, gender diverse people's rights, or where they're violated, like take portions of those recommendations and kind of use it for your advocacy, or even for holding the government accountable is very important. So I think there's a huge role that PLEI can play. Um, I think, can I move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is a few more suggestions. Mobilizing your community by documenting their stories. I mean, whichever communities we are working on, I'm sure there would be some specific systemic housing issue that you encounter and you see. So documenting those stories, those experiences are invaluable. They're very, very important. We have some resources. So like we have a submission template. You can use it if it's helpful to document those issues, and also sharing how the systemic issues impacts communities. As I said, it's not only one person. There are several people who are impacted maybe for a housing discrimination that a newcomer faces. So it's important to engage with this participatory mechanism, because as I said, like the law is now passed, we have the law, but to engage with it, if people are not engaging, communities are not using it, I don't think so the purpose of the law would be fulfilled. So it's more and more we talk about it, we disseminate information and how it's impacting people. I think it would be the next step of the law. So that's why I think it's a very important role that PLEI organizations can play in this entire sharing information, and also kind of an active role in supporting communities to make submissions to this newly formed systems. And can I have the last slide, please? Okay, so here are a few of the resources that you might find helpful. So we do have a glossary of key terms around right to housing. It's a concept. Sometimes there are very jargons which are used by several experts, but sometimes it's difficult to comprehend. Maybe you know it all, but at the same time, it's not easy when you understand in practical language. So what we have tried to do is we have a very easy, accessible language guide here around the key terms on right to housing. We have a toolkit, the right to housing toolkit, which has the law, the NHSA, and also how you can engage with the NHSA. We have a submission template. Also, if anybody is interested in making submission, how you incorporate the human rights language in your submissions, we have a guide around that. So those are all available in our websites, and we will also, I think Hannah already posted them in the chat, and we can do that again once I'm done talking. So yeah, so that's some of the ways that you can actually engage with this. And I believe that's the last slide, Hannah. Can you just move to the next one? Oh, so here we are. So I'm happy to answer any questions if you have. And also here is a link to our newsletter. We do share a newsletter fortnightly, like every 15 days, which has a lot of news around the right to housing sector and the housing sector in general, advocacies or trainings or information sessions happening around if you're interested, feel free to sign up for that. And that's it. So I'll wait for your questions and we'll see that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful. I do see a question actually here in the Q&A. So let's dive in. And yeah, we have lots of time. So feel free, everyone, in the chat, in the Q&A, and any questions or comments you might have, please do share. We are running at about, we'll wrap up in the 45-minute mark. So we have some time. So our question here is, what are specific mechanisms that can be used to address the systemic issues of evictions into homelessness locally or nationally? Thank you.
Excellent question. Very difficult answer. But yeah, so like eviction is definitely one of the systemic housing issues that we have come across and we have heard from folks, and it affects again, it affects different people differently. I mean, obviously, eviction in nowhere it's good, but you have a lot of intersectional issues within evictions as well. Like when it affects, like we are working currently with youth who face evictions and the challenges that they have. So like that, like there are a lot of times indigenous persons or even like newcomers, it would affect them very differently. So it is something very important to note that each individual's experience of evictions are different, but there are a lot of similar effects as well. So in terms of international law, if I have to go by, eviction is the last resort that adjudicators should take. That's what the international law talks about. But unfortunately, we don't adhere to that when we see in the landlord tenant boards that's happening around the provinces. And also provincial laws has got different provisions, like there aren't a uniformity around when an eviction should happen, or even there are some provinces where there aren't enough mediation process, like even the before the eviction happens. So we do kind of struggle with that. And so it could be like if you are seeing a particular kind of eviction, like I am based out of Toronto. I hear a lot of renovictions that is happening for landlords' own use, or sometimes it's completely malafide. So you can see a particular kind of eviction. And so I'm saying that if you see there are many people who are affected, you can actually start collecting their voices, their testimony, how it has impacted their quality of life, and sometimes how much struggle they have put in to even fight an eviction case. And there could be submissions that could be made to the federal housing advocate. There could be some recommendations coming on, and there are a lot of tenant organizations. Excellent work is happening around the country. There are a lot of localized solutions that has been there around, a landlord registry. About you hear a lot of times and a lot of work has happened in silos as well. But I think it's important that if the people are interested, you can make submissions to the federal housing advocate on a particular issue, and what the most kind of evictions that you see and which communities are impacted by it. I would say I don't know that answered your questions properly, but there are ways that we can definitely think to use this NHSA to, for systemic evictions that we see.
Mm. That's great. Thank you so much. And yeah, if you have a follow-up question to that, please feel free to ask it again there in the Q&A. I see sort of there's another question that came in, but I think this other one might be more of a follow-up. What about a ban on no-fault evictions, as is currently the case in England as of May 2026?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's I think that's one of the suggestions that has been probably, floating around when you talk to housing experts. There could be a lot of learnings that we can take from various other organizations, or even other countries, similar countries who has been struggling with eviction. So there could be a lot of innovative options around especially no fault evictions, because that's something that's a menace that has happened around so many jurisdictions for that what we see. So yes, of course. I mean, there could be, and this could be the recommendations when we talk about systemic evictions, or submissions when we are doing a work around eviction particularly. So there could be, excellent like similar jurisdiction suggestions that we see around, which we can implicate in Canada.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you so much. And then, okay, perfect. And I see how much of NRHN's budget goes toward housing cases versus general communication.
That's an excellent question. I'm not the budget person, so I probably am not the right person to answer this question. But we don't do individual cases as part of NRHN. As I said, we work as a connective tissue for the housing justice movement. So what we generally do is our job is definitely to make sure that this NHSA that came in 2019 to make that law work. And one of the things we do it is to make sure that that communities know about this law and how they can engage with the mechanism. So that's the primary role that NRHN plays, apart from doing a lot of policy work and working with the government to make sure that all the housing policies that comes through are compliant to the right to housing framework. So that's another big part of our work. So yeah, so we don't work individually for sure, but we do a lot of work around, as you said, like not I won't say it's only communications, it's also passing on the information, disseminating information so that people actually can engage with this law and also know about what it means for them particularly. So that's a big part of our work.
I know, a hard one to answer. That's great. Thank you so much. That's great. Okay, and then two more here. So can you share a bit more about the work you just mentioned with youth facing eviction?
Sure. It's an interesting project. It's a project which is a kind of a phase two of a project, is what I would say. So 3 years back, we were part of a project. We worked with a law professor called Sarah Buller from the University of Saskatchewan, NRHN and CCHR, Canadian Center for Housing Rights. So we worked with youth to understand like the challenges that they see while navigating through eviction in the access to justice system. And we had hold two workshops, one in Saskatoon and one in Toronto, to talk to directly the rights holders to understand the gaps that they see in the system, and what they would want the adjudicators to know, while passing the eviction orders. So we kind it was a very interesting model that we kind of followed on, and we kind of worked with in that. So currently, what we are doing is we started this work last year. So we have formed a youth advisory where there are around 10 youth rights holders who are part of it. So we do have some youth sessions with them to understand again, the gaps that they see in the system, and also original idea of the project was to bring the adjudicators in on board and to have a dialogue with the youth to understand the ground realities, because that's one thing was missing in this decision making. But very unfortunately, even after trying quite hard, we didn't get the adjudicators because I don't think so they were willing to listen to the youth and to be part of the process. So right now we are working with the youth, but we also want to kind of move ahead with the system after we get the recommendations from the youth through the advisory, maybe with the federal housing advocate, or even have a disseminate like a recommendations for the federal government that what they need to do, especially to address this very critical gap where we see a lot of homelessness with youth leading because of eviction, and also how that impacts people. So we are working with on those intersections, and it's an interesting thing because we are hearing directly from this youth advisory who are guiding us in our work to create the practical solutions that we want to see to address the difficulties youth face while navigating evictions, the access to justice system. But we also see a lot of informal eviction, like it's not always people are evicted, they just hear the landlords uh, maybe threatening them to leave the premise, and they would just leave because they don't know what to do. There's a lot of lack of legal information. So yeah, so we are kind of so that the project faces on that. And if you're interested, I mean, I can't do multitasking, but I can kind of share the report of the earlier the project. We might be interested to read that what the youth wanted the educators to know, so I can just kind of share the link here.
That would be great. I'll speak
I'll
for
do
her, but
that.
that would be great. Yes, I'd be happy to share. That sounds great. Okay, and then I think just a few minutes left, but I hear we have another question here. Have there been cases, panel, advocate, etc., topics dealing with the practice of some landlords of checking rental tribunal hearing reports to weed out potential problem tenants?
I don't directly practice in the tribunal, so I won't be like really, I mean, not the perfect person to answer these questions. But we do hear amongst like a lot of tenant organizations when we attend meetings, or any of the, we have heard about this issue about the problem tenants that you talk about, kind of that, and that is definitely something totally discriminatory, totally illegal. It should not be at all kind of permissible. But whether there has been any practice of real sort, I'm not too sure of that. I need to kind of check
Mm.
through the lawyers organizations and people who actually represent tenants in the court.
Yeah. That's fair. Okay, thank you so much. And yeah, if anything, I can follow up with that later on. That's no problem. And then youth homelessness is a crisis that requires urgent response. What is the government doing now to address it? Anything on that? I know you're getting a lot of easy questions today. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very sad. It's really a crisis situation when you talk to youth, when you see, and it is across the country. Our systems are not uniform. Like the legal representation that the youth get in different provinces are very skewed. Like even in Ontario, like where you have probably some of the targeted clinics which provides services to the youth. I mean, that's not enough, and there are provinces where there is nothing. So a lot of times there is no legal representations, nothing. So I think there has been a lot of suggestions, recommendations from various reports, the reports that I spoke about. So there has been a lot of work around that, but unfortunately, nothing concrete has come out yet, like that what we know of, which might be useful because and there aren't enough data, like how many youths are affected, or how many youth services are there. Like it's very difficult to even for a particular province to to answer that question, that how many people come to you or how many people are actually in need. There aren't any data. So I think that's why the budgetary allocations are also very differently done. So it's very unfortunate, but I don't think so there has been targeted a lot of projects around organizations, particularly on this issue around youth homelessness. So which is definitely a dire need, and that we see on the ground as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. I see just another question here actually in the chat, and then we should probably wrap up. But are there any is there any organization which supports displaced women who are disproportionately impacted economically by spousal breakdowns, specifically in middle age? That might
Let
be
me read the question. Which supports. Okay. I think. I mean, I'm not too sure, but
Mhm.
I think there is some like resources that we can also probably do that.
Yeah.
We do have a resource list. Wait, I can share this with you, like in our website. I mean, if that's helpful. I'm not sure if you would find the exact link that you're looking for, but maybe worth a try.
Yeah, sure.
Uh,
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
I
Is it the resources, NRHN resources page?
yeah, I kind of I'm just typing it. Wait.
Oh, no worries, no worries.
Yeah.
As you're doing that, oh, wonderful. Okay, perfect. I saw another comment, by the way, that said wasn't able to click on some of the links. Hopefully that wasn't the case for everyone, but what I will do, just because we're out of time, but I will be sending around an email with those links. They do for sure work in case that you can't access them through Zoom, for some of you, but I will be circulating that, so no worries. Folks will get those. And if there's any other questions or follow-ups, I had a question about to learn a little bit more, Malika, about your some more work from NRHN, but we had lots of questions today, which is wonderful. I just wanted to say a really big thank you for your presentation today. That was so informative. Again, there will be a follow-up email. I'm going to share the recording link. It'll be posted on our website. I'll email it around for those who weren't able to attend today. I'm also going to make sure your email is there. Yes, you're putting it in the chat. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm sure some folks have extra questions or want to connect. So I appreciate that. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your Thursday to join us today, and share your questions and comments, and stay sort of participatory today. So thank you again. And again, if anything, you can reach out to our speaker today. Later on, you'll get an email, and have a lovely rest of your week, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you next time. Bye, folks.